When you think of medieval assassins, your mind probably goes to shadowy figures in hooded cloaks, masters of stealth and deadly precision. But that's Hollywood talking. The reality was far grimmer. Medieval assassins weren't mysterious warriors trained in hidden temples. They were desperate people, pushed to the edges of society, with nothing left to lose. They lived brutal, short lives filled with betrayal, paranoia, and terror. Being an assassin in medieval times wasn't glamorous or romantic. It was a nightmare wrapped in violence and desperation. In this video, we'll explore the harsh truth behind these forgotten figures and discover why their world was darker than any legend suggests. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Picture this. You're living in a world where shadows held more danger than you could ever imagine, where desperate souls crept through castle corridors, not for glory, but simply because they had nowhere else left to turn. The medieval assassin you see wasn't born from some romantic notion of adventure. These weren't the sleek, trained killers we see in movies today. No, these were people who had fallen so far down life's ladder that taking another person's life seemed like the only rung left to grab. Most of them were just ordinary folk, really. Peasants who'd lost their farms, soldiers who'd been cast out in disgrace, thieves who'd developed a reputation for getting things done quietly. The wealthy, well, they never got their hands dirty. If you owned land, or had a title, or even just possessed a simple goat, you were the one doing the hiring. You'd sit comfortably in your manor, sliding coin across wooden tables, whispering names into the ears of desperate men and women who had nothing left to lose. And oh, the names they whispered. Those were never easy targets. You weren't being asked to eliminate some quiet farmer tending to his turnips. No, it was always the heavily guarded baron, the bishop surrounded by loyal followers, someone with enough enemies to need an army of bodyguards and a castle with a moat. The money might have seemed tempting at first glance, but by the time you were sitting across from someone making such an offer, desperation had already made the choice for you. No family waiting at home, no bright future on the horizon, and certainly no comfortable retirement to look forward to. Think about the complete absence of any job benefits. There were no vacation days, no moments of recognition, no evenings where you could simply relax and forget about work. You couldn't exactly advertise your services, couldn't hang a sign outside your door announcing your particular skill set. At the tavern, when strangers asked what you did for a living, you'd have to come up with something believable. Perhaps you'd claim to be a traveling merchant, selling carpets or pottery. Anything to avoid explaining those mysterious stains on your clothes, or why you always seemed to know the quietest routes through every town. This was the reality, you see. Nobody grew up dreaming of such a life. These people had been chewed up by circumstances, spat out by a world that offered few second chances. They weren't heroes in anyone's story, weren't even memorable villains. They were footnotes, living reminders that made everyone just a little more nervous when walking alone at night. Now, let's talk about training, because here's where reality gets even more grim. There were no hidden monasteries with wise old mentors offering guidance by candlelight. No inspiring music playing in the background while you learned ancient techniques. No dramatic training, montages where you gradually became more skilled and confident. Most of these assassins learned their trade the hard way, by simply not dying during their first few attempts. They were amateurs, really, people with perhaps a decent sense of direction and the ability to move quietly without drawing attention to themselves. If you'd been a soldier before, that was considered excellent preparation. At least you knew which end of a knife to hold. But if you hadn't, well, the basic concept of using a blade isn't terribly complicated. The real challenge came afterward, escaping the scene with your life intact. That required either genuine skill or, more commonly, just extraordinary luck. There were no instruction manuals, no guild meetings where experienced assassins shared tips with newcomers. No safety briefings explaining the finer points of the profession. You had to figure out on your own how to identify when a noble might be using a body double, or where the secret exits from bedchambers were typically located. You learned these things while hanging precariously from window ledges, wondering if you'd accidentally climbed into the servants' quarters again, instead of your target's private rooms. These moments of confusion could mean the difference between completing your task and spending your final moments in a dungeon. Poison was another area where trial and error ruled the day, with a heavy emphasis on the error part. Sometimes your carefully prepared concoction would work exactly as intended. Other times, your target would simply feel a bit dizzy and become more suspicious of their food. And occasionally, in the worst-case scenario, you'd accidentally consume the wrong cup yourself. There was no medieval version of poison control to call for advice. Just hope, amateur knowledge of herbs, and a strong stomach for the uncertainty of it all. If you were extraordinarily lucky, you might learn a few useful techniques from thieves or mercenaries you encountered. Maybe an older, more experienced assassin would show you how to walk across cobblestones without making that telltale squeaking sound. But mentoring wasn't standard practice in this line of work. It was rare, and usually brief, because assassins didn't retire to peaceful cottages in the countryside. They simply disappeared, one way or another. As for weapons training, forget about learning to use impressive swords or exotic tools. You worked with whatever you could acquire and conceal. Usually a dagger taken from a guard, perhaps a garrote if you were feeling particularly ambitious, and whatever other small tools could fit under your cloak without making noise when you moved. You weren't some master of ancient martial arts, despite what stories might suggest. You were simply someone with rough, calloused hands, the ability to move silently, and an unhealthy familiarity with back alleys and hidden passages. Your success didn't come from years of careful preparation and training. It came from pure survival instinct. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, often messily, then vanishing into the night before anyone could get a good look at your face, or create a sketch to post on church doors around town. Your education in this grim profession was brutal, practical, and offered no graduation ceremonies, just bruises, bloodstains, and the constant knowledge that each job might very well be your last. The life of a medieval assassin begins with a simple truth. Money makes people do terrible things. But here's where the story gets interesting. The money was almost always a lie. Picture this. Someone approaches you in a dim tavern, promises you silver, real silver, enough to change your life. Half now, half when it's done, they say. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? What they don't tell you is that when it's done actually means something else entirely. It means after we make sure you didn't mess up, after we confirm you didn't leave evidence, after we decide whether you're more useful, dead than alive. The harsh reality was, this when you hired an assassin, you didn't want a business partner, you wanted a ghost. So there you'd be, having just risked everything, maybe having killed some sleeping baron in his chambers. Not glamorous, not clean, just brutal work in the dark. You'd return expecting payment, only to find your client had mysteriously vanished. Terribly sorry, they'd say if you were lucky enough to find them at all. More often, they'd try to solve the payment problem with a knife to your ribs. After all, dead assassins don't demand wages. Even when you did get paid, the coins felt light in your hand. Never quite enough for the risk, never enough for the blood, certainly not enough for those 3 miserable days you'd spent hiding in a flea-infested haystack, wrestling with what you'd become. You'd get a handful of silver, a quick nod, and a reminder that this conversation never happened. Sometimes, the whole thing was a trap from the start. Political games played with human pieces. You'd be sent after some dangerous target, only to discover it was a decoy, surrounded by guards who'd been waiting for you. Congratulations, you'd just walked into your own execution, with your name already carved on the gallows post. The strangest part was, you couldn't exactly seek legal remedy. Imagine marching into court and announcing, "Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassination contract." The only courthouse you'd see would be the one where you were the main exhibit. This taught you harsh lessons about trust, mainly that you shouldn't. The gear, of a real assassin tells us everything about the gap between fantasy and reality. Forget the elegant weapons and magical gadgets you might imagine. There were no retractable blades hidden in wrists, no smoke bombs for dramatic exits, no enchanted daggers that glowed in the dark. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or conceal without making noise when you moved. If fortune truly smiled on you, and we're talking about the kind of luck where you find gold in a dead man's boot, you might own a decent dagger. Nothing fancy, nothing curved like some mythical serpent's fang. Just sharp, hopefully free of rust, and ideally one that didn't carry the scent of its previous victims. Poison existed, certainly, but it wasn't the sophisticated tool of elegant murder we might picture. Medieval toxins were unpredictable concoctions made from plants, minerals, sometimes even toad organs. Some worked quickly, others took hours to show effects. Some made your target violently ill for days before they recovered, now angry and deeply suspicious of every meal they encountered. Rope had its uses: strangulation, climbing, restraining someone, but only if you actually knew how to use it under pressure. Nothing ruins a deadly encounter quite like fumbling with knots while muttering about which end goes where. Bows were effective weapons, assuming you had one, knew how to shoot accurately, and could somehow smuggle it into a palace while pretending to be a harmless flower merchant. Most assassination work happened up close, personal, intimate, in the worst possible way. No time for careful aim or elegant technique, just quick movements, quiet footsteps, and hopefully not so much mess that you'd slip in it afterward. You didn't get backup equipment either. When your blade bent, broke, or disappeared down a well, improvisation became everything. A piece of slate from a roof, a rusty nail, a shoe buckle wielded with desperate intent. These tools lived hidden in the hems of your clothes, tucked inside your boots, sometimes concealed within hollowed-out bread if circumstances demanded it. You kept them close not for comfort, but because in this grim profession, your weapon served as best friend, employer, and retirement plan, all in one. There were no upgrades between jobs, no careful maintenance of your equipment. You simply prayed it wouldn't fail you at the crucial moment. The deeper truth was this: the weapon itself never did the actual killing. It was always you, alone, poorly equipped, and carrying expectations that seemed impossible to meet. This was the reality behind the romantic notion of the medieval assassin, a world of broken promises, vanishing clients, and the constant knowledge that each job might be your last, not because of the danger to your target, but because of the danger you represented to everyone who'd hired you. Picture this: a world where killing someone important wasn't just about creeping up behind them with a knife. Medieval assassins had to be part athlete, part actor, part ghost. They weren't hunting down ordinary folks either. Nobody hired you to eliminate the local blacksmith or the woman who sold turnips at the market. Your targets wore crowns, carried scepters, commanded armies. These were the most protected people in the known world, and those people, well, they surrounded themselves with enough security to make a modern bodyguard weep. Dozens of guards patrolled every entrance, every corridor, every shadow where danger might lurk. Some guards stood at attention by the main gates, others watched the servant quarters, and a few just existed to look terrifying. Their job was simple: make sure nobody got close enough to their lord to cause trouble. You'd spend endless nights memorizing how each guard moved when they changed shifts, which one had a habit of falling asleep standing up. You learned the sounds of every creaking floorboard, counted steps between doorways, noticed that the guard captain always stopped to scratch his beard at the same torch every hour. But guards were just the beginning of your problems. Medieval castles weren't built for convenience. They were built like stone nightmares, designed to keep people out. Thick walls rose up like cliffs, dotted with narrow windows that archers used to rain death on unwelcome visitors. Gates weren't just heavy doors, they were massive barriers protected by iron teeth that could drop without warning. And then there were the moats, those rings of dark water that surrounded the castle like a liquid fence. The water wasn't just deep, it was often home to things with teeth. Even if you managed to swim across without drowning, you still had to worry about the murder holes, those charming little openings where defenders could pour boiling oil on anyone trying to climb the walls. Yes, boiling oil was a real occupational hazard. Your career choice came with the genuine possibility of being turned into a very crispy, very dead person, just for getting too close to the wrong window. Inside the castle, you faced an entirely different kind of challenge: the staff. Cooks who knew every face that belonged in their kitchen, scribes who noticed when someone walked differently than they should, stable boys who could spot a stranger from across the courtyard. These weren't trained soldiers, but they were your worst enemy. One suspicious glance, one whispered conversation, and suddenly the guard captain knew exactly who didn't belong. Medieval servants were masters of gossip, and gossip in a castle moved faster than wildfire. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and newcomers stuck out like summer snow. Your success depended on avoiding their attention completely, because once you were noticed, you were finished. Your actual target lived in a state of constant, justified paranoia. These nobles and bishops and military leaders had climbed to power by stepping on other people's ambitions. They knew that half the people who bowed to them during the day were probably planning their downfall by night. Family members with competing claims to titles, rivals who wanted their position, allies who might change sides if the price was right. They never ate food without having someone else taste it first, never slept without multiple locks securing their doors. End quote. Some even used decoy bedrooms, moving between different chambers like pieces in a deadly game. Others rotated their sleeping arrangements so unpredictably that even their closest servants couldn't predict where they'd spend the night. Public events weren't easier, just different kinds of impossible. Sure, your target might drink too much wine at a feast, but you'd be surrounded by 50 witnesses, 3 hunting dogs that could smell your nervousness, guards who stayed sober specifically to watch for trouble, and even a jester whose job included noticing things that seemed out of place. Getting close enough to strike could take weeks of preparation. You might pose as a servant, learn the daily routines, bribe someone who already had access, or literally hide in supply barrels, hoping nobody checked too carefully. And when your moment finally arrived, you had exactly one chance. One silent, perfect, completely undetectable opportunity to complete your mission and disappear forever. Failure meant becoming a very public example of what happened to people who threatened the powerful. Your body would hang from the castle gates with a sign warning other would-be assassins about the consequences of poor career choices. Now, forget every dramatic image you've ever seen of mysterious killers in flowing black robes. Real medieval assassins looked like anyone else having a particularly bad century. Disguises weren't sophisticated. They were whatever you could find, steal, or improvise. Peasant clothes that hadn't been washed in months, a monk's robe that was either too large or too small, maybe a guard uniform that still carried the previous owner's distinctive aroma. The goal wasn't to look impressive, it was to look completely forgettable. But forgettable, in medieval times, meant appearing as unwashed, underfed, and generally miserable as everyone else, struggling to survive. You didn't stand out because of mysterious clothing. You stood out because you kept fidgeting with your belt to hide the dagger wrapped in cloth and tied to your waist. Face coverings were more liability than asset. Most masks or veils made you look like someone with a contagious disease, which was excellent for avoiding conversation, but terrible for getting invited to important gatherings. If someone questioned your presence, you had to improvise quickly and convincingly. Brother Marcus, hear about the prayer schedule and roof repairs. Sister Agnes, delivering herbs for the kitchen. Even if your disguise worked initially, it wouldn't work for long. Castle servants knew each other. They knew the regular visitors. They definitely knew who belonged where and when. They noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones that couldn't name the head cook or didn't know which corridor led to the stables. You were always one curious question away from being beaten unconscious with whatever heavy object was handy. And if you did manage to blend in successfully, congratulations, you now had to maintain your false identity for hours while surrounded by potential targets and trying to look like you belonged there. Also, theatrical wigs didn't exist yet. If you needed to appear older or younger, you rubbed dirt on your face, changed your posture, and hoped nobody got close enough to realize your beard was attached with honey and prayers. Your disguise bought you maybe 5 minutes of confusion, just long enough to get where you needed to be. After that, you had to either complete your mission and vanish, or be so convincing in your role that nobody questioned your presence. Getting caught meant explaining why you were hiding in the bishop's private chambers, wearing a nun's habit and carrying a sword, which was exactly as awkward as it sounds. Medieval assassins worked alone, not by choice, but by necessity. There were no teams of specialists, no clever inventors creating poisoned rings and collapsible crossbows, no mysterious organizations providing training and support. You had yourself whatever weapon you could acquire, and a healthy suspicion of absolutely everyone. Professional killer guilds were mostly stories told in taverns by people who'd had too much ale and not enough excitement in their lives. You were more likely to encounter a talking horse than find another assassin interested in comparing techniques and sharing advice. The isolation wasn't just professional, it was existential. In your line of work, every person who knew your true identity was a potential death sentence. Every conversation was a risk, every relationship a vulnerability. Your clients might not even know your real name, and if they did, you were already planning how to disappear permanently once the job was finished. Companionship was a luxury you couldn't afford. Friends asked inconvenient questions about your irregular schedule and mysterious injuries. Romantic partners noticed bloodstains on clothing, wondered why you always slept with weapons within reach, got curious about those scars you claimed came from farming accidents. You couldn't settle down anywhere, couldn't build the kind of life that required trust and predictability. One person recognizing you in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and your entire existence became a desperate race for the nearest hiding place. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were social creatures who worked in groups and shared information. You were the person who made other people disappear permanently. They feared you, or worse, saw you as someone whose very presence could attract unwanted attention from authorities. Nobody wanted to share a meal with someone whose profession involved ending lives for money. You couldn't talk about the difficulties of your work, couldn't seek sympathy for the nightmares that came with silently eliminating corrupt officials and rival nobles. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At roadside inns, you chose the darkest corner, always sat with your back to the wall, never stopped watching the entrance. You never drank enough to dull your reflexes, never stayed anywhere longer than absolutely necessary. You didn't share your real name unless someone paid you first, and even then, it probably wasn't actually your name. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of existing without leaving traces, of moving through the world like smoke that could turn deadly when the wind changed directions. Sometimes, the most dangerous moment in a dangerous profession isn't when you fail, it's when you succeed. Picture this: you've just completed the perfect job. The blade found its mark. Your target dropped silently to the floor. And now, congratulations, you have exactly 30 seconds before your real nightmare begins. Medieval assassination wasn't like the stories make it seem. There were no rooftop celebrations, no casual meetings with satisfied clients, no moment to catch your breath and admire your handiwork. The second that dagger struck true, your job description changed completely, from killer to hunted. The city would lock down faster than you could blink, gates slamming shut, checkpoints sprouting up like mushrooms after rain, and suddenly every guard in town had your description, probably sketched on parchment, with the helpful note, extremely stabby. Approach with caution. You'd planned your escape route beforehand. Of course, that was Survival 101. But plans had this funny way of falling apart when real life got involved. Maybe your getaway horse was on the wrong side of town. Maybe that helpful boatman who never asked questions suddenly developed a conscience. Maybe you were bleeding from a wound you hadn't even noticed during the excitement. The streets that seemed so familiar during your careful planning now felt like a maze designed specifically to trap you. And here's something the stories rarely mention. Your client, the person who hired you, they weren't waiting around with a smile and a bag of gold coins. Smart clients disappeared the moment the job was done, because an assassin who'd just proven they could get anywhere and kill anyone, well, that person knew far too much for anyone's comfort. You walked away from every successful job with two things: a handful of coins and a target painted on your back in invisible ink. Success meant starting over in a new city, under a new name, with even more enemies than before. It meant weeks of sleeping in haylofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in dark alleys, and practicing your best impression of Brother Marcus, humble monk, definitely not a professional killer. But let's step back a moment, because failure was something else entirely. Medieval assassins lived in a world where second chances didn't exist, where sorry, I'll try again. Tomorrow wasn't an option anyone would live long enough to say. Imagine you'd done everything right, taken the job, mapped your route, bribed the right doorman, disguised yourself as the most convincing chimney sweep in the kingdom. Then something went wrong. Maybe your target turned around at exactly the wrong moment. Maybe they had their child with them. Maybe your hand shook like a leaf in a storm when the crucial moment arrived. Congratulations, you are now a dead man walking, because failure in this profession didn't mean a stern talking to or a bad performance review. It meant a very public, very painful, very theatrical death, the kind involving ropes and fire and medieval devices with cheerful names like the Bone Crackers Special. Missing your target meant blowing the entire operation wide open. Your mark survived and immediately started telling everyone within earshot about their near-death experience. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow anymore. You were a wanted man with a detailed description posted on every tavern wall for 30 miles. Those guards you'd snuck past so cleverly, now they were motivated, really motivated. The kind of motivated that came with knowing a killer was loose in their city. But sometimes the guards weren't your biggest problem. Sometimes it was your own client. Because a failed assassin wasn't an asset anymore. They were a liability. Someone who could be caught, tortured, made to talk about who hired them and why. The very people who'd paid you would often be the first ones to put out a second contract, this time with your name on it. There's a certain dark irony in that, being killed by the same profession you'd chosen, by someone just like you, trying to clean up the mess you'd become. The shame of failure cut deeper than any blade, because you hadn't just failed to kill, you'd failed to be invisible, to be perfect, and for assassins, perfection wasn't a goal, it was survival. Anything less might as well have been a death sentence with extra steps. It didn't matter how many successful jobs you'd completed before. Nobody cared about your impressive track record when you were standing there empty-handed with a very much alive target, pointing at you and shouting for the guards. In this profession, you were only ever as good as your last kill, and if your last kill didn't happen, well, you'd better have a really good head start. The medieval world didn't have much patience for failure, especially the kind of failure that left important people very much alive and very much angry. Public executions weren't just punishment, they were entertainment, and a captured assassin was the kind of entertainment that drew crowds from 3 villages over. So picture our hypothetical killer, successful this time, slipping through those back alleys with someone else's blood on their boots, and the sound of pursuit already echoing off the narrow walls. No time to think, no time to plan, just pure survival instinct, and whatever escape route they'd hopefully prepared beforehand. The city behind them would be buzzing like a disturbed beehive, important people demanding answers, guards running in all directions, doors slamming shut as everyone tried to figure out who they could trust. And somewhere in that chaos, our assassin would be trying to become invisible again. Just another face in the crowd, just another traveler heading out of town for perfectly innocent reasons. But invisibility, real invisibility, that was an art form all by itself. It meant knowing how to walk differently, talk differently, even think differently. It meant becoming someone else so completely that even you almost believed the lie. And it meant living with the knowledge that this success, this perfect job, had probably just made you more enemies than you'd ever had before. Because that's the thing about the assassination business. Every success created new problems. Every completed contract added new names to the list of people who wanted you dead. It was a profession that ate its own, where today's successful killer became tomorrow's target, where survival meant constantly looking over your shoulder and sleeping with one eye open. Picture yourself in a world where shadows seemed to move on their own, and death could come from something as simple as a shared meal. Medieval times weren't just about knights and castles, they were about fear, superstition, and the strange figures who lived at the edges of society. The people who made their living through stealth and violence faced a peculiar kind of torment. Sure, they had to worry about guards, about getting caught in the act, about finding their next target, but there was something far worse waiting for them. The collective imagination of an entire population that believed in magic. To understand this, you have to remember that most people back then couldn't read. They didn't understand how diseases spread, or why some people seemed to move more quietly than others. When something couldn't be explained, well, it must be supernatural. And if you were already doing something as dark as taking lives for money, people's minds went to very creative places. Village folk would whisper that these shadowy figures weren't entirely human. They'd say some could change their shape, becoming cats or ravens to slip past guards. Others believed they could turn invisible, but only until touched by blessed water from a church. The stories got wilder from there. Tales of people who made deals with spirits that lived deep in the forests, who could somehow breathe poison through solid stone walls. Walking through any town or village became a strange kind of theatre. Mothers would pull their children closer, muttering warnings about making eye contact. They genuinely believed a simple glance could curse their baby, or bring sickness to their livestock. Even the most ordinary things became suspect when you were already viewed as something unholy. Your tools, the simple instruments of your trade, they took on mythical properties in people's minds. A basic knife wasn't just sharp metal anymore. No, it had to be forged in some cursed workshop, probably by a blacksmith who'd sold his soul. And poison, well, that was obviously witchcraft. People imagined elaborate rituals, stirring deadly concoctions with body parts under moonlight, speaking to demons for the perfect recipe. You might think all this fear would work in your favor. After all, if people are terrified of you, they'll stay out of your way, right? But fear makes people do unpredictable things. When an entire community believes you're a monster, they don't just avoid you, they actively try to destroy you. Medieval mobs didn't hesitate, like modern people might. They didn't need evidence or trials. Someone would die unexpectedly, maybe from illness, maybe from an accident, maybe they just choked on their dinner. But immediately, whispers would start. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was the shadow man. Maybe he cursed them from across the village square. This meant you could never, ever settle down. Staying in one place too long was like signing your own death warrant. Eventually, some priest would start ringing warning bells, and farmers would grab their pitchforks with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for harvest festivals. They'd been waiting their whole lives for a chance to fight real evil, and you were it. Getting caught with anything unusual was basically a death sentence. Dried plants for medicine, foreign coins from your travels, even speaking with an accent from the next kingdom over. Any of these could have someone screaming about sorcery before you could explain yourself. And once that word got shouted, torches got lit very, very quickly. The medieval mind worked in simple patterns. If you were too quiet, too clever, too fast, you must be supernatural. And supernatural threats had to be eliminated immediately, preferably with fire, because fire purified everything. Now, if you wanted to kill someone without all the noise and blood of a blade, you might think about poison. It sounds elegant, doesn't it? Just a little something in the wine, and your target quietly slips away. No screaming, no mess, just a gentle exit from the world. The reality was nothing like that fantasy. Poisoning someone in medieval times was incredibly frustrating, like trying to win a sword fight, using nothing but angry thoughts and wishful thinking. First, you had to actually get your hands on something deadly. There were no convenient shops selling reliable toxins. You had plants, mushrooms, certain minerals, maybe some unfortunate amphibians. Each of these had to be gathered, prepared and tested, usually on yourself, in tiny amounts. And even then, you never really knew what you had. Measuring was pure guesswork. You couldn't precisely calculate doses like some medieval chemist. You'd estimate, hope, and pray to whatever gods might be listening. Too little, and your target just gets a stomachache and becomes even more paranoid about security. Too much, and you might accidentally poison yourself just from handling the stuff. Medieval kitchens were chaotic places, full of people, smoke, and confusion. You couldn't just stroll in and casually season the stew with deadly nightshade. You had to bribe someone, disguise yourself as a servant, or sneak around hoping no one noticed the stranger messing with the food. And if your target was important, eating became a military operation. They had people whose entire job was tasting food before it reached the noble's mouth. Sometimes 3 different tasters, plus a dog, just to be extra careful. By the time that meal made it to the actual target, it had been examined more thoroughly than a suspicious traveler at a city gate. Let's say you managed all of this successfully. You got the poison, you got it into the food, nobody detected it, and your target actually ate it. Now comes the really unpredictable part, waiting for it to work. Some toxins took effect in minutes, others took days. Your mark might be laughing at jokes one moment, then suddenly clutching their stomach and calling for their personal astrologer to read the stars for answers. Medieval people blamed everything on supernatural forces anyway, so poisoning symptoms often got attributed to curses or divine punishment. And, if your target survived, which happened more often than you'd think, guess who got blamed? Not the cook who prepared the food, not the tasters who were supposed to catch this sort of thing. You, the mysterious figure with knowledge of herbs and a reputation for making people nervous. Poisoning was slow, unreliable, and full of variables that could go wrong at any moment. Worse yet, if you were caught attempting it, you didn't get a quick execution. Medieval justice involved a lot of creative questioning, using tools specifically designed to encourage very detailed confessions about your methods, your accomplices, and your supernatural allies. The life of a medieval assassin was less about dramatic rooftop chases and mysterious hooded figures, and more about constant fear, unreliable methods, and a population that saw monsters in every shadow. In a world where people believed magic was real and evil wore human faces, being too good at violence made you something far worse than just a criminal. It made you a nightmare that entire communities would unite to destroy. Picture for a moment the strangest career in medieval history. You spent your life removing problems that powerful people couldn't solve any other way. A duke here, a merchant there, maybe even someone's beloved hunting hound. Yet, despite changing the entire course of kingdoms with your work, nobody would ever know your name. This was the peculiar fate of the medieval assassin. Success meant invisibility. The better you were at your job, the more completely you vanished from history's pages. While knights got songs and kings got monuments, you got nothing but whispers and shadows. Your clients never wanted a hero's tale. They wanted something much more valuable, plausible deniability. The moment word got out about who actually did the deed, their own necks were on the line. So your identity became the most carefully guarded secret in the realm, more precious than gold, more protected than royal bloodlines. You learned early never to use your real name. Never to brag about your work over ale in taverns. Never to keep souvenirs or trophies that might connect you to past jobs. You existed only in the moment between drawing your blade and disappearing into the crowd. Before and after that instant, you were nobody at all. If somehow your name did surface, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. Names were loose ends, and loose ends in your profession had a way of getting cut very quickly, usually with something sharp. The irony was almost poetic. You might have prevented wars, toppled tyrants, even saved entire kingdoms from disaster. But there would be no statues in your honor, no grateful speeches from the throne. If you were lucky, you'd get an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground. If you were unlucky, your head would end up decorating the city gates with a sign reading traitor. Sometimes your name survived only as a warning whispered in dark corners. Remember what happened to Lord Aldrich, they'd say, shaking their heads. But the ghost, who made it happen, well, he was already long gone and forgotten. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was the entire point of your existence. You were meant to be the blade that strikes from nowhere, leaving no trace of its passing. Heroes got remembered because they stood in the light. You worked in shadows that swallowed everything, including yourself. But let's say you survived long enough to collect your payment. Congratulations, you just accomplished something truly miraculous in medieval times. Now came the really dangerous part, trusting the person who hired you to keep their word and protect your secret. This trust was almost always misplaced. Your client hadn't chosen you out of friendship or respect. They'd picked you because you were willing to do something they couldn't stomach themselves. You were a tool, and once the job was finished, you became something far worse in their eyes. A witness. You knew who wanted whom dead. You knew when and why and how much they were willing to pay for it. This knowledge made you incredibly dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them personally. The solution was usually swift and permanent. Some clients simply pretended they'd never met you. Others took more direct action, sending another assassin to tie up loose ends. There were even cases of double booking, where one killer was hired to do the main job while another waited in the wings to eliminate the first one immediately afterward. No loose ends, no witnesses, no problems. The truly ambitious clients played an even more complex game. They'd hire you to remove their enemy, then hire your enemy to remove you, creating a neat little circle of violence that left them completely clean. It was efficient, cost-effective, and utterly ruthless. If you were foolish enough to try blackmail, threatening to expose your client unless they paid more, well, that was certainly bold. It was also typically your final career move. Medieval nobles didn't negotiate with shadows, who knew too much. They crushed them like insects and slept soundly afterward. Even the rare client with a shred of honor presented problems. They might pay you and leave you alone, but they'd never really trust you. How could they? If you'd killed once for money, what stopped you from killing again? They'd spend sleepless nights wondering if you might decide they knew too much about you for comfort. So even success brought its own special kind of doom. You were the secret that couldn't be allowed to speak, the shadow that had seen too much light. Your very existence was a threat to people with the power to make problems disappear permanently. Now imagine somehow beating all these impossible odds. You survived the contracts, the betrayals, the poison in your wine, and the daggers in dark alleys. You outlived enemies, employers, and probably your own conscience along the way. Surely now you could retire to some quiet village and live out your days in peace. Absolutely not. Medieval assassins didn't get retirement parties or cottage gardens or peaceful final chapters. You didn't fade gracefully into civilian life. You simply vanished, usually in ways that weren't particularly comfortable. The mathematics were brutally simple. You carried too many secrets, knew too many names, had too much dangerous knowledge rattling around in your skull. People didn't want you retired and reminiscing over your career. They wanted you permanently silent, even if nobody actively hunted you. And that was asking a lot. You had to live with constant fear that someone might. Perhaps some ambitious young killer had just received a contract describing a mysterious figure who used to be someone very dangerous indeed. Your past had a way of catching up, usually when you least expected it. So you changed names again, moved to some forgotten village where people minded their own business. Maybe you faked a war injury, claimed to be a former soldier or merchant's guard. You sold herbs or mended tools, anything that kept you invisible and unremarkable. But the work had changed you in ways that couldn't be disguised. You always sat facing the door. You jumped at unexpected sounds. Crowds made you nervous, and strangers on the road sent your hand drifting toward hidden weapons. You kept emergency coins buried under floorboards, though they still carried the smell of the last man you'd earned them from. Sleep became a luxury you couldn't afford. Dreams were dangerous things that might make you talk or cry out names better left unspoken. You couldn't love anyone, because love required trust, and trust could get people killed. You couldn't laugh too loudly, or drink too deeply, or do anything that might draw attention to yourself. Years of careful violence had rewired something fundamental in your mind. You lived like a dead man pretending to be alive, a ghost wearing the mask of humanity, but never quite managing to fool anyone. Least of all yourself. The strangest part was how this isolation became its own kind of prison. You'd spent so long being nobody that you'd forgotten how to be somebody. Your real name felt foreign on your tongue. Your actual memories got tangled up with cover stories until you weren't sure which parts of your life had actually happened. This was the ultimate irony of your profession. You'd made yourself so good at disappearing that you couldn't find your way back to existing. There was no endgame, no final chapter where everything worked out. Just a slow, cold fade into nothingness, always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the dark, and nobody noticed you were gone. Perhaps that was the best ending an assassin could hope for. Not glory or wealth or recognition, but simply the mercy of being forgotten completely, taking all those dangerous secrets with you into whatever comes after shadows. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about power is believing you understand how to wield it. Medieval assassins learned this lesson, usually right before they died. Picture yourself stepping into that world, cloaked in mystery, convinced you'd be some kind of shadow warrior. The reality would hit you like a muddy cobblestone to the face. You wouldn't be sleek, or graceful, or whisper quiet. You'd be cold, hungry, and completely out of your depth. The very first problem would be the chickens. Medieval streets were absolutely crawling with loose chickens. Nobody warns you about that in the stories. You try to make some dramatic escape, slip on chicken droppings, and find yourself tackled by a guard named Thomas, who'd just been dumped by his girlfriend. Your target would move locations without telling anyone. The guards would be drunk, but still trigger happy. And that stable boy you thought you'd bribed would sell you out for half a loaf of bread and a warm ale. Information wasn't exactly reliable back then. Even if everything went perfectly, which it wouldn't, you'd still face the aftermath. No allies, no honor, no retirement plan. Just a lifetime of hiding behind false names in villages that still believed in fairies. The assassin's life wasn't romantic, or noble, or even profitable. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but shadows. You didn't make history as an assassin. You erased yourself from it. The only thing waiting at the end was silence that nobody would question, because nobody remembered you were there in the first place. But some people were born to be remembered. Take a young princess from the rugged lands of Epirus, originally called My Tale. Before she became the feared Queen Olympias of Macedon, before she shaped one of history's greatest conquerors, she was already touching something divine. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself. Whether hero's blood actually ran in her veins doesn't really matter. What mattered was that this wasn't a woman born for the sidelines. From childhood, Myrtale was drawn to serpents, omens, and the wild ceremonies of Dionysus. While other princesses embroidered tapestries, she danced barefoot in moonlight, calling upon gods in states of trance. Ancient sources probably written by men both terrified and fascinated, claimed she kept sacred snakes in her chambers. Some said they coiled beside her in bed. Whether this was literal truth or the kind of slander that powerful women attract like flies, we'll never know, but it stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her real power didn't come from battlefields or throne rooms. It flickered to life in torchlight, among priestess whispers and the curling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just a princess. Now, she was a living oracle, touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. When Philip II of Macedon arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess, he met a mystery he couldn't resist. Philip was brutal, brilliant, and famously fond of collecting wives like trophies, but this encounter was different. Their marriage wasn't just political alliance, it was a collision of prophecy and power. Lightning supposedly struck the sky on their wedding night. Olympias, as she was now called, dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. Philip had visions of sealing his wife's womb with a lion, an actual lion. Whether they believed these omens or invented them, they acted as if their child was destined to rule the world. Macedon wasn't an easy kingdom to navigate. Kings were killed by cousins, brothers turned into rivals overnight. It was a land of iron and ambition, where survival required constant vigilance. But Olympias walked in with her head high, eyes already on the crown. The marriage was rocky from the beginning. Philip, for all his genius, wasn't built for monogamy. He married multiple women, always for power, often for alliances. But Olympias refused to sit quietly in shadows. She held her own court, maintained her own alliances, turned to oracles and rituals to divine the future. Then came Alexander's birth, wrapped in celestial drama, flames, supposedly danced around the child without burning him. Whether the visions were real or manufactured, they served their purpose. This child would be remembered not just as a prince, but as something approaching divine. Even as Alexander was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his later Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice. This wasn't just domestic jealousy, it was strategic warfare. Cleopatra was pure Macedonian, and any son she bore would threaten Alexander's legitimacy in the eyes of local nobility. Olympias saw the palace clearly for what it really was. Not a home, but a battlefield, and she would use every snake, every dream, every ritual and whisper she possessed to make sure her son wasn't just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer the tribal princess Myrtale. She was Olympias now, and nobody would take her son's throne without facing her first. Picture a teenage boy watching his mother navigate a palace that had become more dangerous than any battlefield. The Macedonian court in Pella wasn't just filled with nobles and advisors, it was crawling with people who smiled to your face while sharpening knives behind their backs. Every conversation carried hidden meanings, every gesture was analyzed for weakness, every friendship could turn into betrayal at a moment's notice. Olympias had learned to speak this language fluently. She understood something that many royal wives never grasped, that survival in a palace required more than beauty or charm. It demanded cunning, patience, and when necessary, absolute ruthlessness. The court was indeed full of serpents, but she had become the most dangerous one of all. Philip's behavior had begun to change in ways that must have felt like slow poison to Olympias. The king, who had once been captivated by this mysterious foreign princess, was now spending more time away from the palace, leading campaigns that seemed to stretch longer each year. When he returned, the wine flowed more freely, and worse still, he listened more carefully to advisors who whispered that perhaps a Macedonian queen might serve the kingdom better. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Philip announced his intention to marry again, not some distant political alliance, but a young Macedonian woman named Cleopatra Eurydice. Her very existence was a threat, but what made it truly dangerous was her uncle Attalus, one of Philip's most trusted generals. This wasn't just about romance, it was about reshaping the entire power structure of the kingdom. The wedding feast became the stage for one of history's most explosive family confrontations. Picture the scene, nobles drinking and celebrating while tension crackled through the air, like lightning before a storm. Attalus, emboldened by wine and his new position, decided to voice what many had been whispering. He questioned whether Alexander was truly Philip's son, or perhaps the child of some god, as Olympias so often claimed. What Attalus meant as mockery, Olympias transformed into mythology. If people wanted to believe her son was touched by divine power, let them believe it. Gods don't negotiate with mortals, they command them. Alexander's dramatic exit from the feast might have looked like a teenager's tantrum, but it was actually a declaration that he wouldn't tolerate disrespect, not even at his father's wedding. Olympias chose a different path, one that would prove far more strategic. She left Macedonia entirely, returning to Epirus where she remained royalty in her own right. Distance, she understood, could be more powerful than presence. From her homeland, she could build alliances, gather intelligence, and watch Philip's new marriage create exactly the kind of instability she could exploit. The assassination of Philip at his daughter's wedding sent shockwaves through the ancient world. Here was a king, at the height of his power, preparing to launch the greatest military campaign in history, struck down by his own bodyguard in front of hundreds of witnesses. The timing seemed almost impossibly convenient for certain people, though proving anything was quite another matter. Within days of Philip's death, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter were both dead. The methods were brutal, designed not just to eliminate threats, but to send a message. Some accounts describe Cleopatra being forced to watch her child die before taking her own life. Others speak of funeral pyres and public humiliation. The exact details matter less than the underlying truth. Mercy had become a luxury that Olympias could no longer afford. This wasn't random violence, it was surgical precision applied to the problem of succession. Every royal child represents a potential civil war, decades in the future. Every rival bloodline is a sword hanging over the throne. Olympias understood that half measures in such situations weren't kindness, they were weakness that would eventually destroy everything she had worked to build. With the field cleared of immediate threats, Alexander's path to the throne became remarkably smooth. At barely 20, he was declared King of Macedonia with surprisingly little opposition. His charisma and education certainly helped, but the real architect of this transition was his mother, working behind the scenes to ensure that the right people felt secure and the wrong people felt terrified. Alexander himself reportedly felt uncomfortable with the violence against Cleopatra's family, yet he didn't intervene, perhaps because he recognized the brutal mathematics of royal succession. Every throne is built on graves, and those who refuse to acknowledge this reality rarely keep their crowns for long. As Alexander prepared for his legendary campaign against Persia, Olympias began to transform her role once again. She stepped back from the daily politics of the court, but never truly relinquished her influence. Instead, she became something like a spiritual guardian, sending sacred objects to her son, consulting oracles about his fate, performing rituals to ensure divine favor. To Olympias, Alexander's conquest wasn't simply about expanding territory or accumulating wealth. It was about fulfilling a destiny that had been written in the stars long before his birth. She had spent years crafting the mythology around her son, weaving together Greek religion, Macedonian tradition, and her own Epiriotic mysticism into something that made Alexander seem inevitable. From her position behind the scenes, she continued to guard the empire her son was building, eliminating threats before they could fully form, nurturing alliances that served Alexander's interests, and maintaining the careful balance of fear and respect that kept potential rebels in line. She had learned that sometimes the most effective power is the kind that remains invisible until the moment it strikes. The story of Olympias reveals something profound about the nature of influence in the ancient world. While men commanded armies and signed treaties, Women like her operated in spaces that were no less dangerous and arguably more complex. They fought wars with whispers and won battles through careful manipulation of symbols and beliefs. Her legacy lived on in every city Alexander founded, every enemy he defeated, every impossible victory that seemed to confirm his divine nature. She had taken a bright but impulsive young man and given him not just a crown, but a mythology powerful enough to sustain an empire that would reshape the entire ancient world. While Alexander blazed across continents like a human comet, back home in Macedonia, his mother Olympias had her own battles to fight. She bore the title of Queen Mother now, a position that sounded ceremonial but carried the weight of true power. The throne might have been empty, but her influence filled every corner of the palace like incense. The regency officially belonged to Antipater, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, a man with grey hair and battle scars. But Olympias had never been one to step aside gracefully. She moved through court like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always watching for the perfect moment to strike. Her letters to Alexander became her weapon of choice. These weren't gentle words from a worried mother, asking about his health, or reminding him to eat well. No, these were political missiles. Wrapped in silk but sharp as daggers, she wrote constantly, her words traveling thousands of miles to reach her son's camp in distant lands. In every letter, she reminded Alexander who his real enemies were. She questioned everyone around him, painting his closest companions as potential traitors. When he began adopting Persian customs, wearing their robes, embracing their traditions, she scolded him like a child who had forgotten his roots. She criticized his choice in wives, his fascination with foreign gods, his dangerous flirtation with divine status. What made her letters so powerful wasn't just their content, but their source. No general, no advisor, no friend would dare speak to Alexander the Great with such boldness, but Olympias had 2 things they lacked: the unshakable bond of motherhood and the mystical authority of a high priestess. She could say what others only whispered in shadows. Back in Macedonia, Antipater watched this correspondence with growing frustration. Every letter Olympias sent weakened his authority, questioned his decisions, undermined his careful work. She used her family connections like a spider uses its web, reaching into Epirus, into Thessaly, into the noble houses that still remembered her as Philip's queen. Rumors were her specialty. A whisper from Olympias could travel faster than a messenger on horseback, spreading doubt, planting seeds of rebellion, turning allies into enemies. She understood something that many rulers never grasped, that sometimes a well-placed rumor could topple kingdoms more effectively than any army. Her letters to Alexander grew more urgent with each passing season. She painted Antipater as another Philip, ambitious and treacherous, ready to seize power the moment Alexander's back was turned. Whether she truly believed this or simply feared losing her own influence remained her secret, locked away behind those calculating eyes. Alexander found himself caught between loyalty and necessity. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind, but he needed Antipater's steady hand to keep Greece stable while he conquered the East. The distance between them made everything more complicated, every decision more dangerous. Olympias watched this delicate balance and waited. Patience had always been one of her greatest weapons. She had endured years of Philip's infidelities, survived court intrigue that would have destroyed weaker souls, outlasted enemies who underestimated her resolve. Now she watched Antipater grow older, more tired, more vulnerable with each passing year. She could see the cracks forming in Alexander's grand design. He was taking on too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, drifting away from the Macedonian values that had made him strong. In her mind, his victories came from divine favor, channeled through her prayers, her sacrifices, her unwavering faith in his destiny. If he forgot that connection, if he forgot who had shaped him into the legend he became, well, Olympias had reminded kings of their place before. Even if this king happened to be her own beloved son, she wouldn't hesitate to do it again. The news of Alexander's death in Babylon arrived like a thunderclap in a clear sky. For most people in Macedonia, It meant the end of an era, the loss of their greatest king, the beginning of uncertainty. For Olympias, it meant something far more personal and devastating, the collapse of everything she had spent her entire adult life building. Her divine son, the storm she had prophesied and nurtured and unleashed upon the world, was gone. No warning, no final battle, no glorious death in combat, just fever and weakness in a foreign city thousands of miles from home. He left behind an empire that stretched from Egypt to India, but no clear successor, no plan for what came next. The generals who had served under Alexander, the men they called the successors, immediately began circling like vultures. They divided up his conquests, carved his empire into personal kingdoms, turned his legacy into a prize to be won or lost. The great dream of a unified world under Macedonian rule crumbled almost overnight. Antipater still controlled Macedonia and Greece, and his feelings toward Olympias had only grown colder over the years. Her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, suddenly became the most sought-after woman in the known world. Every ambitious general wanted to marry her, hoping her bloodline would legitimize their claims to power. Olympias could see the civil war approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. It wasn't a question of if, but when the bloodshed would begin. Without Alexander to protect her, without his divine authority to shield her, she became just another player in a deadly game with rapidly changing rules. But she still had one crucial piece left on the board: Alexander's infant son, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married during his eastern campaigns. The baby carried Alexander's blood, his name, his potential claim to everything his father had conquered. Roxana was young, frightened, far from her homeland, and surrounded by people who saw her child as either a tool or a threat. Olympias allied herself with the young mother, offering protection and guidance, but also recognizing the political value of controlling Alexander's only legitimate heir. The old queen understood that this infant boy represented the last pure connection to Alexander bloodline, the final hope for continuing his dynasty. That made the child incredibly valuable, but also incredibly dangerous. Every ambitious general would either want to control him or eliminate him. Antipater's death brought a moment of hope, but that hope quickly soured when his son Cassander took control. Unlike his father, who had at least respected Olympias as Alexander's mother, Cassander felt no such sentiment. He was cold, calculating, utterly ruthless in pursuing his goals. The collision between these two forces became inevitable. Olympias, the serpent mother, who had shaped a conqueror, faced off against Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and absolutely no patience for her political games. The shadow of Alexander loomed over both of them, a ghost whose legacy would be claimed by whoever survived the coming storm. The great fortress of Pydna stood silent by the water, its walls holding the last flicker of a dying flame. Inside those ancient stones, an old woman waited, surrounded by enemies who had come to collect a debt written in blood. This was no ordinary woman, though. This was Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great, and she had returned to Macedon, not to beg for mercy, but to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. You see, the kingdom had fallen into chaos after her son's death. Power had scattered like leaves in autumn wind, and everyone wanted a piece of the empire that once stretched from Greece to India. Cassander, son of her old enemy Antipater, was making his move, seizing control with cold calculation. Meanwhile, Roxana, Alexander's widow, sat trapped with her young son Alexander IV, the last legitimate heir to the throne. They were prisoners in all but name, watched carefully by men who saw them as inconvenient reminders of better days. Olympias understood the game being played. If she did nothing, her grandson would simply disappear one night, another casualty of political convenience. The bloodline of Alexander would end not with glory, but with a quiet murder in some forgotten room. So she made her choice, striking a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general who still commanded respect among the old guard. When she crossed back into Macedonian territory, something remarkable happened. Towns that should have resisted her opened their gates instead. Soldiers who served her enemies began switching sides, drawn by the power of her name and the memory of her son. Even her opponents hesitated, unsure how to handle a woman who carried herself like living mythology. But Olympias hadn't returned to play politics. She had come for revenge, and she took it with theatrical precision. One by one, she hunted down Cassandra's supporters, turning the kingdom into her personal stage for divine justice. When she captured Philip III, Alexander's half-brother who had been used as a puppet king, she ordered his execution without hesitation. His wife Eurydice faced the same fate, strangled when she refused courtesy of taking her own life. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully choreographed statements about power and legitimacy. Olympias wanted everyone to understand that only Alexander's bloodline had the right to rule Macedon. Everyone else was just pretending, playing with crowns that didn't belong to them. For a brief moment, her strategy worked. She held the kingdom in her grip, ruling with the authority of a woman who believed she spoke for the gods themselves. But power in the ancient world was fragile, especially when it depended on fear and mythology rather than armies and gold. Cassandra regrouped, gathering resources and allies while Olympias celebrated her victories. When he returned, the tide shifted quickly. His forces outnumbered hers, his treasury ran deeper, and his patience had turned into something much more dangerous. One by one, Olympias watched her supporters melt away, choosing survival over loyalty. Even Polyperchon, her key ally, found his influence waning as practical men chose practical sides. Soon she found herself trapped in Pydna, that coastal fortress where she would make her final stand. The siege lasted nearly a year, a slow strangulation that tested every ounce of her legendary willpower. Food became scarce, disease crept through the garrison, and hope flickered like a candle in winter wind. Yet through it all, she maintained her royal bearing, refusing to show weakness, even as her world crumbled around her. Cassandra faced his own dilemma during those long months. Killing Olympias would eliminate a threat, but it might also create a martyr. She was, after all, the mother of Alexander the Great, a figure who had achieved something close to godhood in the minds of common soldiers. Striking her down might seem like blasphemy, turning practical politics into religious warfare. So he offered her terms: surrender, he promised, and her life would be spared. She could live out her remaining years in comfortable exile, removed from politics but safe from harm. Olympias, who had spent decades watching royal promises turn to dust, knew better than to trust such words. But hunger was no longer just discomfort. It had become a death sentence for everyone inside those walls. Eventually, her garrison broke. Faced with starvation, her followers opened the gates and handed her over to Cassandra's forces. But even then, her enemy hesitated to act directly. Instead, he chose a crueler path, turning her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate, he declared, washing his hands of the final act. The families condemned her to death, as everyone knew they would, but when the moment came for someone to carry out the sentence, an extraordinary thing happened. The executioners stood frozen, unable to strike the first blow. Here was an old woman, frail and defeated, yet she carried herself with such regal authority that grown men trembled before her. These were Macedonians who had grown up hearing stories of her mystical rituals, her prophetic visions, her sacred serpents. They had cheered her son as he conquered the known world, believing him to be touched by divine power. And that power seemed to flow from her even now, as she faced death with the same unwavering gaze that had once intimidated kings and generals. Finally, Cassandra had to send foreigners to complete the task, men who had no memory of her legend, no childhood fears of her supernatural reputation. They saw only an old woman and a job to be done. And so Olympias died, not with the ceremony due to royalty, but in brutal simplicity that matched the harsh realities of her world. Her death marked the end of something greater than just one woman's life. With her fell the last meaningful connection to Alexander's bloodline, the final thread linking the present to that golden age, when one man's ambition had reshaped the world. The empire founded on dreams of divine conquest flickered and went dark, leaving only memories and monuments to mark where gods once walked among mortals. Yet even in death, Olympias cast a long shadow over the ancient world. History would remember her not just as Alexander's mother, but as a force of nature in her own right, a woman who understood that power meant nothing without the will to use it completely. Sometimes the most dangerous people in history are the ones who never held a sword. Picture a world where power moved through whispers, where belief could topple kingdoms, where a mother's ambition could reshape the entire known world. This was the realm of Olympias, a queen who understood something most rulers never grasped. Fear and faith, when woven together properly, could be more devastating than any army. She wasn't born to rule through gentle persuasion. The ancient world had no patience for soft queens, no mercy for those who showed weakness. Olympias learned this lesson early, learned it well. Earn it well, a night well. While other women of her time managed households, she managed destinies. While they raised children, she crafted legends. Her son would become Alexander the Great, but that greatness didn't happen by accident. It was carefully constructed, piece by piece, myth by myth. The stories say she slept with serpents, that she wrapped herself in prophecy like other women wrapped themselves in silk. People called her a witch, a murderer, a manipulator. They weren't wrong, but they weren't seeing the whole picture either. In her time, these weren't insults, they were survival skills. The throne room was just another battlefield, and Olympias fought her wars with poison cups instead of bronze swords, with whispered rumors instead of charging cavalry. Think about the power of making people believe your child is divine, not just special, not just blessed, but actually touched by the gods themselves. Olympias didn't just give birth to a future king, she created the mythology that would carry him across 3 continents. Every ritual, every carefully placed prophecy, every mysterious ceremony, all of it served one purpose: to build a legend so powerful that reality would bend to accommodate it. Her battlefield was cold, calculated, patient. She understood that killing your enemies was easy, but making them afraid to oppose you in the first place, that was art. Political marriages became chess moves. Priestesses became messengers. Oracles became weapons. She turned religion into statecraft, and statecraft into destiny. The ancient historians struggled with her story, just like we do today. Was she a villain or a visionary, a loving mother or a ruthless strategist? Maybe the question itself misses the point. She was a survivor in a world that devoured the weak, and she not only survived, she thrived. She outlived gods, outlasted empires, and haunted the legacy of the most famous conqueror in history. Even her death tells us who she really was. No peaceful passing in royal chambers for Olympias. She died in the dust, abandoned by the very people she'd once commanded, executed like a common criminal. But here's the strange thing about history. Sometimes it remembers the ones who went down fighting more clearly than the ones who died comfortably. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, but her legend endured. Every story of a ruthless queen, every whisper of bloodline destiny, every empire built on carefully crafted myths, carries a little piece of Olympias with it. She's still there in the shadows of every throne room, coiled like a serpent, waiting. Her bones turned to dust long ago, but the lessons she taught about power, about belief, about the dangerous art of making myths into reality, those lessons are eternal. She proved that sometimes the person behind the throne can be more important than the one sitting on it. Far from the political intrigue of ancient Macedonia, on a sun-bleached island in the Mediterranean, another kind of mystery waits. Crete holds secrets that make even Olympias' story seem straightforward. Here, among ruins that feel more like dreams than actual places, we find traces of something extraordinary. A civilization that disappeared so completely that for centuries, people thought it was pure mythology. The palace at Knossos defies easy explanation. Imagine walking through corridors that twist and turn without apparent reason, staircases that lead nowhere, rooms that double back on themselves. Even today, with maps and guides, it's easy to lose your way completely. Now imagine encountering this place 3,000 years ago, when it was alive with people, when its walls gleamed with fresh paint, when its corridors echoed with languages we can no longer understand. This wasn't just a royal residence, it was an entire world under one roof. Nearly 150,000 square feet of interconnected rooms, workshops, shrines, storage areas, and living spaces. The engineering alone was remarkable: running water, multi-story construction, sophisticated air circulation systems. Some archaeologists believe they even had the world's first flushing toilets. This was cutting-edge technology wrapped in bewildering architecture. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans stumbled upon this maze in the early 1900s and immediately saw connections to one of Greece's most famous legends. The labyrinth of the Minotaur, that terrible story of a monster half-man, half-bull, trapped in an impossible maze beneath a palace. Evans looked at the twisting corridors of Knossos, saw the bull imagery covering every surface, and wondered if he'd found the birthplace of the myth itself. Bulls were sacred to these ancient people, the Minoans as Evans named them. Bull imagery appeared everywhere, painted on walls, carved into stone, crafted into tiny golden charms. The bull represented power, fertility, the untamed forces of nature. But why build your palace like a maze? Why create a space deliberately designed to confuse and disorient visitors? Maybe the answer lies in understanding what the palace really was. Not just a home for royalty, but a sacred space. A place where the ordinary rules didn't apply. Walking through Knossos might have been like entering another world, a place where reality bent according to different laws. The confusion wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The maze wasn't a prison, it was a transformation. Here's the fascinating thing: no one's ever found an actual underground labyrinth at Knossos. No prison chambers, no monster's den, no literal maze separate from the palace itself. What we have instead is something more subtle, more mysterious, a building that is itself the labyrinth, a space where the line between architecture and mythology dissolves completely. The Minotaur may never have existed, but something equally powerful was born in these corridors. The idea that a place could be so complex, so bewildering, that it became legendary. That human ingenuity could create something so extraordinary that it transcended ordinary reality and became myth. The deeper archaeologists dig into Minoan civilization, the more questions emerge. These people built palaces without fortifications, created art without warfare, developed technology without conquest. They seem to have lived by different rules entirely, rules we're still trying to understand. Perhaps that's the real magic of Knossos. Not that it inspired a specific legend, but that it reminds us how much mystery still surrounds our past. How many civilizations rose and fell, leaving only fragments, only puzzles, only questions that lead to more questions. The palace keeps its secrets well, but it's generous with wonder. Picture, if you will, a creature that was half human, half bull, prowling through corridors that stretched endlessly into darkness. This beast lived in a prison so twisted, so impossibly complex, that anyone who stepped inside would wander forever, lost among stone walls that seemed to shift and breathe. Now, this wasn't just any monster we're talking about. This was the Minotaur, and its home was a labyrinth that existed somewhere between nightmare and reality. The only person who ever managed to face this creature and lived to tell about it was a young man named Theseus, and even he needed help. A princess named Ariadne gave him something simple, yet brilliant, a ball of thread to mark his path through the maze. But here's where things get interesting. This story, this myth that has captivated people for thousands of years, it didn't just spring from someone's imagination. It grew from something real, something that once existed on an island in the Mediterranean Sea. Long ago, there was a king called Minos who ruled over the island of Crete. He was powerful, wealthy, and according to the stories, he demanded a terrible price from the people of Athens. Every year, 7 young men and 7 young women had to be sent to Crete as tribute. These unfortunate souls would be fed to the Minotaur, locked away in its underground maze. The creature itself was born from shame and divine punishment, a twisted reminder of what happens when mortals anger the gods. It became a symbol of something dark hiding beneath beauty and power, like a secret that a king keeps buried in the basement of his palace. To the ancient Greeks, Crete was a place of wonder and fear. The people who lived there, the Minoans, seemed almost otherworldly. They were elegant traders who sailed across the Mediterranean, but their customs were strange, their art was unlike anything the Greeks had seen, and their palaces were unlike anything anywhere. Bulls were sacred to these Minoan people. Their artists painted scenes of young men and women leaping over charging bulls in what must have been breathtaking, dangerous rituals. Stylized bull horns appeared everywhere, on rooftops, on altars, carved into sacred spaces. When you combine this bull worship with a palace that feels like an endless maze, you start to see how a legend might be born. But what if the Minotaur was never meant to be taken literally? What if it was something deeper, a story that carried the weight of real history? Some people who study these things believe the myth might be a memory, a distant echo of a time when Athens really did have to pay tribute to Crete, when the Minoans were the stronger power in the region. In this reading, the labyrinth becomes a symbol of political entrapment, the way smaller nations can become lost in the complex demands of more powerful neighbors. The Minotaur then would represent the raw, terrifying force that keeps that system in place. Others see it differently, more personally. They think the labyrinth represents the unconscious mind, all those twisting passages of thought and memory that we carry inside us. The Minotaur becomes our hidden urges, our buried fears, and Theseus represents anyone brave enough to walk into that internal darkness, guided only by the thin thread of self-awareness. The real palace at Knossos, the one you can visit today, is the closest thing we've ever found to an actual labyrinth. No monster lurks in its corridors, no princess waits with a ball of thread. But there's something there, something that feels like walking through a dream someone else once had. The Minoan civilization flourished for over 1,000 years, from around 2600 to 1400 BCE. These weren't people who conquered through violence. They built their power through trade, through art, through relationships that stretched across the known world. Their ships carried pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury goods to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to the distant shores of Spain. What makes the Minoans so fascinating is how different they were from the Greeks who came after them. Their art celebrated life, nature, movement. You see dancers in their frescoes, dolphins playing in the waves, athletes performing impossible feats of courage and grace. Their goddesses were powerful figures, often bare-breasted, holding snakes that might have symbolized fertility, transformation, or protection. The palace at Knossos sat in a fertile valley, not perched defensively on a hilltop like later Greek structures. It had no massive walls, which suggests the Minoans either felt completely secure on their island or were powerful enough that no one dared attack them. Their confidence was built into their architecture: multi-story buildings, courtyards lined with columns, plumbing systems that wouldn't look out of place in a modern home. And yet, for all their sophistication, the Minoans left us with a puzzle we still can't solve. Their writing system, called Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day. We don't know what they called themselves, we don't know what their kings believed, we don't even know what prayers they offered to their snake-holding goddesses. All we have are their ruins, their beautiful art, and their influence on the people who came after them. The Minoans were architects of mystery, in the truest sense. They built not just palaces, but questions that echo across thousands of years. Knossos wasn't merely a building, it was the heart of a civilization that sparkled like sunlight on the Aegean Sea for a moment in history, then faded into legend. But perhaps that's the most beautiful part of all. Sometimes, The line between history and myth becomes so blurred that we can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The Minotaur may have been a monster, or a metaphor, or a memory of something that once walked through corridors that still exist, waiting for visitors who come seeking not just ancient stones, but the echo of something that once was magnificent and strange and utterly unique in the ancient world. The ancient palace of Knossos was like stepping into a dream, where reality bent and twisted around every corner. Picture yourself walking through corridors that seemed to breathe with their own life, where nothing followed the rules you might expect from a building. This wasn't your typical royal residence. The Minoans created something that spanned roughly 150,000 square feet, containing over 1,000 rooms of every imaginable purpose. Some chambers were barely large enough for a single person, while others opened into grand spaces that could hold dozens. The genius lay not in their size, but in how they connected to each other, like a vast puzzle made of stone and clay. The builders used the natural landscape as their canvas, working with slopes and creating terraces that lifted the structure up to 4, sometimes 5 stories high. A massive central courtyard anchored everything, likely serving as the stage for public ceremonies and those famous bull-leaping rituals that still capture our imagination today. Getting around required more than just walking. It demanded a kind of mental mapping that few visitors could master. Corridors would split without warning, sending you down paths that might lead to storage rooms filled with giant clay jars, or perhaps to workshops where artisans crafted delicate pottery. Light wells carved through the building's heart brought sunshine to unexpected places, while staircases spiraled upward into shadows or suddenly emerged into bright, open courtyards. The Minoans were remarkably clever with their engineering. They understood how to move air through their complex, creating natural cooling systems, using shafts and open stairwells that drew hot air up and out. Fresh air flowed in to replace it, keeping even the deepest rooms comfortable during scorching Mediterranean summers. Water flowed through the palace via an intricate network of clay pipes, channeling precious rainwater to where it was needed most. They even had flushing toilets, a luxury that wouldn't become common elsewhere for many centuries. These weren't crude facilities either. They were sophisticated systems that showed just how advanced Minoan civilization had become. One of the most mysterious spaces was the throne room, dominated by an alabaster chair built directly into the wall. Stone benches flanked this seat of power, while magnificent frescoes of griffins, those mythical creatures with eagle heads and lion bodies, watched over everything. Were these paintings meant to guard whoever sat in that chair? Was this the seat of a king, a queen, or perhaps a high priest? The silence of the ruins keeps their secrets well. The walls throughout Knossos spoke in brilliant colors that still astonish visitors today. Dolphins danced across bathroom walls, their playful forms seeming to swim through the air above ancient bathtubs. Elegant women appeared in fresco after fresco, wearing flounced skirts and displaying their bare chests in what was clearly the height of fashion. But perhaps most captivating were the images of young people leaping over charging bulls, frozen forever in moments of incredible courage and grace. This art wasn't simply decoration, it was identity made visible. The Minoans saw themselves as part of the natural world, connected deeply to both earth and sea. Their paintings reflected this philosophy, showing humans not as conquerors of nature, but as participants in its endless dance. The spiritual life of Knossos was woven into every stone and painted surface. Unlike later Greek temples with their imposing columns dedicated to specific gods, Minoan worship was subtle, integrated into daily life in ways that made the sacred and secular almost indistinguishable from each other. Small shrines tucked into corners provided quiet spaces for personal devotion. Pillars rose throughout the complex like sentinels, many decorated with sacred symbols. The horns of consecration, those distinctive curved forms that appeared on rooftops and altars throughout the site, marked spaces where the divine and human worlds touched. The bull dominated Minoan religious imagery, but not as something to be feared. These people celebrated the bull's power, incorporating it into rituals that combined athleticism with spiritual devotion. Those famous bull-leaping scenes weren't just artistic flourishes. They likely depicted actual religious ceremonies where young men and women performed death-defying vaults over charging animals. This wasn't entertainment. It was sacred theater. Each leap represented a symbolic victory over chaos, a demonstration of human courage in the face of raw, natural power. The participants weren't just athletes. They were spiritual performers offering themselves to forces larger than any individual. Among the most intriguing discoveries at Knossos were the snake goddess figurines found in storage rooms deep within the palace. These remarkable objects show women with raised arms, serpents coiled around their bodies or held firmly in their hands. Their bare breasts and confident poses radiate authority rather than submission. To the Minoans, snakes represented the mysteries of life itself. These creatures moved between the world above and the underworld below, shedding their skins in endless cycles of death and rebirth. The goddess figures weren't just religious objects, they were guardians of the household, protectors of fertility and the continuation of life. The rooms where these figurines were discovered suggest that worship at Knossos was often intimate and personal. Families and individuals could find their own sacred spaces within the larger complex, creating private altars in quiet corners away from the bustle of palace life. When you combine all these elements, the frescoes, the horns, the altars, and those bewildering corridors, canals, and those bewildering corridors, and those bewildering corridors, not so, begins to reveal its true nature, and those bewildering corridors, and those bewildering corridors, and those begins to reveal the true nature, and those before, the same. This wasn't just a palace with some religious decorations added on. The entire structure was conceived as a kind of spiritual machine, designed to facilitate connection between the human and divine realms. There was no need for a separate temple because the palace itself was the temple. Its labyrinthine layout wasn't a mistake or poor planning. It was intentional, meant to create a sense of wonder and disorientation that opened visitors to spiritual experiences they might not encounter in more conventional buildings. Walking through Knossos meant entering a world where myth took architectural form, where a simple corridor might become a pathway to the gods, and where the sound of footsteps echoing in stone chambers joined a chorus of whispered prayers that had been offered there for generations. This was architecture as spiritual practice, building as religious expression, where every room served not just practical purposes, but also connected its inhabitants to the mysterious forces that the Minoans believed governed their world. Time has this peculiar way of swallowing civilizations whole, then spitting them back up centuries later for curious minds to puzzle over. Such was the fate of an ancient palace that slept beneath Greek soil for thousands of years, dreaming its Bronze Age dreams, while the world above forgot its name entirely. Picture, if you will, olive groves stretching across rolling hills on the island of Crete. Farmers tending their crops, their plows occasionally striking something hard, something strange. Ancient seals emerging from the dirt. Fragment of pottery painted with curious designs. Hints that something enormous lay buried beneath their feet. For generations, these artifacts surfaced like memories trying to break through, but nobody quite understood what they meant. Then came the year 1900, and with it, a British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans. He was the sort of man who lived and breathed ancient myths, who could read Homer's epics and see not just stories, but treasure maps pointing toward lost worlds. Evans had heard whispers about these mysterious finds, these clues scattered across the Cretan countryside, and something deep in his scholarly heart told him to dig. When he purchased that unremarkable plot of land and began his excavation, Evans had no idea he was about to wake up one of the most magnificent civilizations the ancient world had ever known. His shovels and brushes slowly revealed walls, then rooms, then corridors that seemed to twist and turn like something from a fever dream. The deeper he dug, the more complex it became. Staircases leading nowhere, chambers connecting to chambers, passages that doubled back on themselves in architectural puzzles that would make modern city planners dizzy. What emerged from the earth was a palace so vast and intricate that Evans became convinced he had found the legendary labyrinth itself, the mythical maze of King Minos, where the bull-headed monster called the Minotaur supposedly prowled through endless corridors, waiting for unfortunate souls to lose themselves in its depths. But this was no monster's lair. This was something far more remarkable, a thriving center of an advanced civilization that had ruled the Mediterranean seas over 3,000 years ago. Evans named these mysterious people the Minoans, after the legendary king whose palace he believed he had uncovered. And what a palace it was! Room after room revealed frescoes painted with scenes that seemed to dance right off the walls, young athletes leaping over charging bulls in gravity, defying displays of courage and skill, elegant ladies with elaborate hairstyles and flowing dresses, their eyes bright with life, despite the millennia that had passed, dolphins swimming through painted seas, flowers blooming in eternal spring, processions of gift-bearers carrying precious offerings through corridors that had once echoed with footsteps and conversation. The Minoans, it seemed, had lived lives of remarkable sophistication. Their artists captured movement and joy in ways that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries. Their engineers designed plumbing systems that brought fresh water into the palace and carried waste away, luxuries that would have amazed visitors from less advanced civilizations. Their craftspeople worked with gold and silver, ivory and precious stones, creating jewelry and decorative objects of breathtaking beauty. But perhaps most intriguingly, these people had developed their own system of writing, a script that scholars today call Linear A. Tablets covered with these mysterious symbols emerged from the ruins, tantalizing glimpses into the Minoan mind, their records and thoughts and daily concerns. The only problem, the script remains completely undeciphered even today. It's as if the Minoans took their secrets with them when their civilization vanished, leaving behind only these cryptic messages that we still cannot read. And vanish they did, suddenly and mysteriously, sometime around 1400 years before the Common Era. For centuries, this palace had stood as a beacon of prosperity and innovation, a center of trade that connected civilizations across the Mediterranean. Ships had arrived daily at nearby ports, carrying goods from Egypt and Cyprus. From the Greek mainland and beyond, the palace had buzzed with activity, its workshops producing goods that would travel to distant lands, its halls filled with merchants and diplomats, artists and administrators. Then something happened, something that scholars still debate with passionate intensity. The palace was abandoned, the frescoes left to fade, the sophisticated civilization that had once commanded respect across the known world simply melted away like morning mist over the Aegean Sea. Some point their fingers at nature's awesome power. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, the volcanic island of Thera, which we know today as Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions in human history. The blast was so massive it likely sent tsunamis racing across the sea, battering the northern coast of Crete and devastating ports and farmland. Ash clouds may have blocked out the sun for months, choking crops and disrupting the delicate climate that the Minoans depended on for their prosperity. While the palace itself wasn't immediately destroyed, the economic and social aftermath of such a catastrophe might have shaken the very foundations of Minoan society. Trade networks that had taken generations to build could have collapsed overnight. Religious faith in their rulers might have wavered when the gods seemed to turn against them with such devastating force. Others looked to more human causes, to the rising power of the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. These warriors and traders may have seen Minoan weakness after the volcanic disaster and decided to take advantage. Archaeological evidence suggests that the palace was briefly reoccupied, but something fundamental had changed. The art became more martial, more focused on warfare and conquest rather than the peaceful scenes of nature and ceremony that the Minoans had loved. Most tellingly, Linear A disappeared, replaced by Linear B, a script used by Mycenaean administrators to keep their records. The palace that had once resonated with snake, goddess rituals and bull dancing ceremonies now whispered in a foreign tongue, its new occupants imposing their own culture on the ancient walls. Some scholars believe this wasn't a sudden conquest, but a gradual absorption. First came increased trade between the mainland and the island, then cultural influence, then political control, and finally outright rule. It's possible that the Minoans weren't conquered so much as slowly overwhelmed, their distinctive way of life gradually giving way to Mycenaean customs and beliefs. Still, others argue for internal collapse, suggesting that civil uprising, political instability, or the simple failure of the ruling elite contributed just as much to the civilization's downfall as any external threat. Perhaps the common people grew tired of supporting the elaborate palace system, or rival factions within Minoan society turned against each other in destructive conflicts. What's particularly striking about the end of Minoan civilization is how little violence seems to have been involved. The archaeological record shows no charred skeletons, no signs of mass slaughter, no evidence of the kind of brutal warfare that marked the end of so many ancient cities. The palace didn't fall with a scream, it fell with a whisper. The great palatial system simply stopped functioning. The rooms went quiet, the rituals ended, and nature slowly, patiently, began to reclaim what humans had built. By the time Homer composed his great epics, this palace was already ancient myth, a memory tangled up in stories of kings and monsters and impossible labyrinths. And perhaps that's fitting, because what ultimately destroyed this remarkable civilization wasn't just volcanic eruption or foreign invasion. It was time itself, and the way all great achievements, no matter how beautiful or sophisticated, eventually give way beneath the weight of new empires and changing circumstances. But the bones of the palace remained, sleeping beneath the soil, waiting for someone like Arthur Evans to brush away the dust of centuries and reveal their secrets once again. Evans wasn't just an archaeologist, he was something of a showman, a man with a flair for drama and a deep appreciation for the theatrical possibilities of his discoveries. He didn't simply excavate the ruins, he actively restored them, using modern materials like reinforced concrete to rebuild walls and reconstruct frescoes. This approach has drawn both praise and criticism over the decades. Some call his work visionary, crediting him with bringing the ancient world to life in ways that pure archaeology never could. Others call it vandalism, arguing that he imposed his own Edwardian imagination on ancient ruins and made it impossible for future scholars to distinguish between authentic Minoan work and early 20th century interpretation. What visitors see today when they walk through the palace is thus a mixture of ancient reality and modern reconstruction, a collaboration between Minoan builders and British restorers separated by thousands of years but united in their desire to create something magnificent and lasting. Whatever one thinks of Evans' methods, there's no denying that he accomplished something remarkable. He gave Europe its first glimpse into a Bronze Age world, far older and more sophisticated than classical Greece, revealing a civilization of maritime elegance, artistic brilliance, and mysterious complexity. He also provided scholars with countless new puzzles to solve, from the undeciphered Linear A script to questions about Minoan religion, politics, and daily life. Most importantly, perhaps, Evans demonstrated that behind the most fantastic myths often lie fragments of historical truth. The legend of the labyrinth, it turned out, was rooted in memories of a real place, a palace so complex and maze, like that visitors might indeed have found themselves, lost in its twisting corridors and interconnected rooms. The Minotaur, of course, was pure fantasy, but the bull imagery that appears throughout Minoan art suggests that bulls held deep religious significance for these ancient people. Those incredible frescoes of young athletes leaping over charging bulls weren't depicting mythological events, but actual religious ceremonies, dangerous rituals that combined athletic skill with spiritual devotion in ways that seem almost unimaginably bold by modern standards. Evans rang the bell that woke this sleeping palace after 3 millennia of dreams. Today, when tourists walk through its restored corridors and gaze at its reconstructed frescoes, they're experiencing something that hovers between archaeology and imagination, between historical fact and educated speculation. They're seeing what the Minoans built, but they're also seeing what Evans thought they built, filtered through early 20th century assumptions about ancient life. Perhaps that's appropriate for a place that has always existed as much in myth as in reality. The palace continues to guard its secrets, continues to challenge our understanding of the ancient world, continues to remind us that human civilization is far older and far stranger than we often realize. In its halls, the boundary between legend and history dissolves, leaving us with stories that are somehow both absolutely true and completely impossible. And if you listen closely, walking through those ancient rooms on a quiet afternoon, you might almost hear the echo of footsteps from the past, the whisper of voices speaking in a language we still cannot understand, the ghost of a civilization that vanished so completely that it took 3,000 years for the world to remember its name. Picture yourself standing in a place where every wall speaks in a language we've never learned to read. The ancient Minoans covered their world with symbols, carved them deep into stone, painted them bright across plaster walls. But here's the curious thing. They never gave us the key to unlock what it all means. Their writing system, something scholars call Linear A, sits before us like a locked door. We can see the marks, trace the lines with our fingers, but the words remain silent. So instead of hearing their voices directly, we have to listen with our eyes, watching the stories they painted, the patterns they carved, the messages they hid in plain sight. Walking through these ancient halls feels like stepping inside someone else's dream. The art here doesn't look like anything else from the ancient world. You won't find endless rows of warriors marching off to battle, no stern-faced kings staring down from walls. Instead, dolphins leap through painted waves, lilies bloom in eternal spring, birds take flight across ceilings that have watched over silence for thousands of years. The people in these paintings seem almost alive, caught in mid-dance, their bodies flowing like water. Even when there's danger in the scene, there's something graceful about it, something that speaks to rhythm rather than violence. These weren't people obsessed with conquest or power. They were celebrating something deeper, the endless cycle of seasons, the dance between earth and sky, the sacred patterns that govern all life. But there's one symbol that appears everywhere you look. A double-headed axe, carved into stones, painted on walls, placed in the most sacred spaces. Some call it the Labris. And it seems to have held special meaning, possibly connected to the divine feminine, maybe tied to the movements of stars and moon. Here's something fascinating. The very word labyrinth might come from labris, which would mean this famous maze wasn't a prison at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred dwelling place. Then you notice these curved shapes, appearing again and again, stylized bullhorns rising from altars and rooftops. They call them horns of consecration, markers that seem to separate the holy from the everyday. Bulls appear everywhere in this ancient world, in paintings, in rituals, in the very heart of their most important ceremonies. Maybe the bull represented the wild power of nature, or fertility, or the chaotic forces that needed to be honored and understood. The building itself might be trying to tell us something too. Some people who study these things believe the palace wasn't just built for practical reasons. The winding corridors, the nested rooms, the way passages curve and double back on themselves, it all might mirror something cosmic, seasonal patterns perhaps, or the journey a soul takes through life and death, and whatever comes after. Without their words, every theory walks a tightrope between insight and wild imagination. These people spoke in symbols instead of stories, left us riddles instead of explanations. So we find ourselves interpreting, guessing, listening for meaning that stays just beyond our reach, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. But here's the remarkable thing about this place. Even in ruins, it doesn't feel dead. Thousands of years have passed since people last called it home, yet something still hums beneath the surface. Not ghosts exactly, not gods, but echoes of questions that refuse to fade away. The labyrinth still holds us, draws us into its mystery, makes us wander its corridors, searching for answers that might not exist. We don't know the names of the people who ruled here. We can't read their prayers or understand their laws. But we know they loved beauty with a passion that outlasted empires. We know they saw the sacred in the natural world, found balance between art and architecture, between the spiritual and the everyday, and we know they were first, building their palace temple city before the Parthenon rose in Athens, before Roman roads stretched across continents, before any of the great monuments we think of as the beginning of civilization. Perhaps that's what makes this place so haunting. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved, like a puzzle. Sometimes it's meant to be felt, experienced, wondered about. The line between fact and legend shimmers here, like heat waves rising from ancient stones. The Greeks who came after turned this mystery into stories, tales of monsters and heroes, of impossible mazes and divine punishment. We've turned it into archaeology, measuring and mapping, and trying to make sense of what remains. But at its core, this place has always been both story and fact, myth and stone, question and answer, dancing together in ways we're still learning to see. Maybe that's why it endures, why it still draws people from around the world to walk its broken corridors and wonder at its painted walls. It doesn't give us all the answers. Instead, it reminds us that some mysteries are worth keeping, some questions are more valuable than their solutions. This ancient place, half remembered and fully mysterious, isn't just a dot on a map, it's an invitation to step deeper into the maze, to let ourselves get lost in the beautiful uncertainty of what it all might mean. The thread of human ingenuity stretches back through millennia, and nowhere is this more visible than in the ancient art of breaking down walls. Picture, if you will, the earliest warriors faced with a massive gate, standing between them and their prize. They did what anyone might do. Really, they picked up a tree trunk, gathered their strongest men, and simply ran at the obstacle with everything they had. These first battering rams were beautifully simple in their brutality. Groups of soldiers would hoist these massive wooden beams, rushing forward like ancient lumberjacks possessed by some fierce purpose. The rhythmic crash of wood against stone, wood against iron, wood against iron, wood against whatever stood in their way, echoing across battlefields like primitive thunder. But human minds, they never stop tinkering, do they? Someone, somewhere, probably nursing bruised shoulders after a particularly brutal ramming session, looked at their crude weapon and thought, there has to be a better way. And so, the battering ram began its own quiet evolution. Engineers, those forgotten artists of destruction, realized something profound. If you mounted that heavy trunk inside a wheeled frame, suddenly your weapon could roll. Add a roof over the whole contraption, and now your crew could work protected from the arrows, the boiling oil, all those unpleasant things defenders liked to drop on attackers. What had been a tool became something far more terrifying, a slow-moving fortress of destruction. The Assyrians, masters of making war, feel like theater, understood something crucial about these rams. They weren't just weapons. They were instruments of fear. Imagine being a defender on city walls, watching these massive siege towers roll toward you, each one combining the crushing power of rams with platforms full of archers. Your gate was being systematically destroyed, while arrows rained down like deadly hail. There was nowhere to look that didn't promise doom. Stone carvings from ancient Nineveh tell these stories in remarkable detail. They show rams tipped with pointed iron, rolling up to city gates like slow-moving gods of destruction. These weren't just machines, they were statements. They announced to everyone watching that surrender was still an option. But time was running out. And rams, clever things, they didn't limit themselves to front doors. Ancient engineers quickly realized that walls had weak points. Watchtowers could collapse, and sometimes entire gatehouses could be brought down with enough persistence. The presence of a battering ram outside your city meant something very specific. Your defenses would crumble like stale bread, unless you acted first. The Greeks, with their love of refinement, took these crude machines and made them elegant. But the Romans perfected everything they touched. Roman engineers built enormous rams called Ares, named after the animal whose stubborn persistence they embodied. These massive contraptions hung suspended on chains inside protective shelters, some so large they required dozens of men just to keep them swinging. Listen to the ancient accounts, and they'll tell you about the sound. The rhythmic swing of these massive beams created a noise like thunder rolling across stone. Imagine that sound continuing for hours, days even, while you huddled behind walls that seemed a little thinner with each crash. Yet for all their brutal simplicity, rams demanded something beautiful from their operators: perfect teamwork. The crew had to maintain their rhythm while defending their machine from burning missiles, stones, and various foul substances that creative defenders hurled from above. A ram that stopped swinging was a ram that died. But when everything worked, when the team found their rhythm and the machine gained momentum, nothing could stop them. It was wooden muscle against human masonry. Ancient physics turned into pure, unstoppable force. But humans, restless creatures that we are, looked at this close-quarters destruction and wondered, what if we could attack from far away? What if we could throw our destruction across distances that kept us safe? And so the catapult was born, not from brute force thinking, but from the mind of the tactician, where rams required you to get close, to feel the heat of boiling oil and hear the curses of defenders. Catapults attacked from comfortable distances. They launched not just stones, but something far more valuable: psychological dread. These were the first real artillery pieces in all of military history, and they changed siege warfare by making physics feel like magic to anyone unlucky enough to face them. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century before the Common Era, products of brilliant minds who wanted to add range and devastating momentum to their warfare. There was this tyrant, Dionysius of Syracuse, a man with expensive tastes in cutting-edge violence, who commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults. These devices used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as enormous tension springs. Think about the genius hidden in this mechanics. Someone figured out that by twisting ropes tightly, especially those made from animal sinew, you could store absolutely enormous amounts of potential energy. When that energy released, it could hurl stones, javelins, even flaming projectiles across distances measured in hundreds of meters. Suddenly, no wall felt quite safe enough. Two main types evolved with surprising speed: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like some giant's crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which could lob boulders either over walls or directly at fortifications. Each had its own personality, its own tactical uses, its own way of making defenders very, very nervous. Then the Roman engineers arrived, and they never met a Greek innovation they couldn't somehow improve. They built catapults that could be completely broken down, packed onto carts like some ancient furniture, and reassembled wherever armies needed them. Portable siege engines for professional armies that moved like deadly nomads across the ancient world. Some Roman catapults could fire 60-pound stones at incredible speeds, fast enough to tear through wooden gates, stone battlements, and unfortunately, any soldiers who happened to be in the way. But catapults offered something beyond mere destruction. They provided spectacle, theater, the kind of display that could break an enemy's will before their walls. Ancient generals, understanding human psychology perhaps better than we give them credit for, used catapults to send messages. Sometimes literally, they would launch corpses over walls to spread disease and terror. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale. In some particularly chilling cases, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early horrifying form of biological warfare. But like all weapons, catapults carried their own limitations. They were heavy, demanded skilled crews who understood their temperamental mechanisms, and rough terrain could render them completely useless. Still, when everything aligned properly, when the crew knew their business, and the ground cooperated, catapults could batter a city into submission from perfectly safe distances. For the first time in history, cities realized something unsettling. Their thick stone walls, built to withstand rams and ladders and all manner of close-quarters attacks, now had to survive dangers from the sky itself. Destruction, it seemed, had learned to fly. Picture a machine so enormous, so intimidating, that just the sight of it could make entire armies pause. The trebuchet wasn't just another weapon. It was pure physics turned into terror. while other siege engines relied on twisted rope or human muscle. This giant had something far more reliable: gravity itself. Think of it like this: a massive wooden arm, longer than most buildings are tall. Balanced on a sturdy frame, on one end sat a box filled with stones, tons and tons of them. On the other end, a leather sling waited patiently. When that counterweight dropped, the arm would whip forward with such force that whatever sat in that sling would fly through the air like a comet. The Chinese figured this out first, way back in the 4th century before Christ. But their version used people, instead of stones, as the weight. Teams of men pulling ropes in perfect timing. It worked, but it wasn't quite the monster that would later terrorize medieval Europe. Somewhere around the 12th century, someone had a brilliant idea: why use people when rocks never get tired? This counterweight version spread through the Byzantine Empire, then into the Islamic world, and finally into Europe. Once it arrived, it changed everything about warfare. These machines could throw a stone weighing as much as a piano over the length of 3 football fields. Imagine sitting behind your castle walls, thinking you're safe, when suddenly boulders the size of dining room tables start raining down from the sky. The psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical damage. But here's what made trebuchets truly terrifying. They didn't just hit walls. They could arc their shots right over those walls, landing in courtyards, barracks, anywhere the defenders thought they were protected. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. And the creativity didn't stop at stones. Medieval armies would load these machines with the most twisted things you could imagine. Diseased cow carcasses, hoping to spread plague inside the city. Pots filled with burning oil or quicklime, designed to blind and burn whoever got too close. Sometimes they'd even wrap insults around rocks, adding psychological warfare to physical destruction. There's this incredible story from Scotland, at Stirling Castle. The English built a trebuchet so massive they called it Warwolf. The thing was so scary looking that the Scottish defenders surrendered before it even fired a single shot. But the English king was so proud of his new toy, he refused to accept the surrender, just so he could see what would happen when they pulled the trigger. Of course, these mechanical monsters had their drawbacks. Building one took weeks, sometimes months. Loading and aiming took forever. You needed skilled engineers who understood counterweights and trajectories, but when everything came together, when that arm swung forward and the sling released its payload, the results were absolutely devastating. While trebuchets rained death from a distance, siege towers took the opposite approach. Instead of throwing things at walls, they simply went around them, or rather, over them. Picture a wooden skyscraper on wheels, covered in wet animal hides to prevent fire, packed with armed soldiers, ready to storm right onto the enemy's walls. These rolling fortresses were audacity made real. They announced to everyone watching that the attackers weren't content to wait outside the gates. They were coming inside, whether the defenders liked it or not. The Assyrians probably used the first ones, crude wooden platforms that got soldiers closer to enemy walls. But like so many ancient inventions, the Greeks took the basic idea and turned it into something spectacular. During the Hellenistic period, these towers became architectural marvels in their own right. The most famous one appeared at the Siege of Rhodes in 305 before Christ. A Macedonian general named Demetrius built something called the Helepolis, which translates to city taker. 9 stories tall, over 100 feet high, armored with iron plates, and moved by thousands of soldiers pushing from inside. It was essentially a mobile castle, designed to roll right up to the walls of Rhodes and deliver an entire army directly onto the battlements. The only problem was, it was too ambitious. The thing literally broke under its own weight, before it could do much damage. But the idea, the sheer boldness of it, that captured imaginations across the ancient world. The basic strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. City walls worked because they kept attackers at ground level, while defenders fought from above. Siege towers eliminated that advantage completely. Suddenly, both sides were fighting at the same height, on equal terms. From the top of these towers, archers could clear the walls of defenders, while soldiers on lower levels prepared to charge across wooden bridges right onto the enemy ramparts. It transformed siege warfare from a patient waiting game into direct, brutal confrontation. But defenders weren't helpless against these rolling giants. They'd dig ditches to stop the towers from getting close. They'd flood areas around their walls, turning the ground into impassable mud. Some would build inner walls, back up defenses that forced attackers to capture the same ground twice. The most dramatic defense was fire. Defenders would launch flaming arrows, trying to set these wooden monsters ablaze before they reached the walls. The sight of a burning siege tower, with soldiers jumping from multiple stories to escape the flames, that became one of the most terrifying spectacles of ancient warfare. When siege towers worked, though, they worked completely. Imagine being a defender, fighting from your wall, when suddenly enemy soldiers start pouring onto your own ramparts. The advantage you'd counted on, the height, the protection, all of it vanished in moments. The battle shifted from keeping enemies out to fighting them in your own space, on your own walls. Picture armies camped outside fortress walls, their siege engines towering against the sky. But while everyone watched the dramatic spectacle above ground, the real devastation often came from somewhere completely invisible. Deep beneath the earth, soldiers worked in absolute darkness, armed with nothing but picks and shovels. This was the world of siege tunneling, a technique that turned warfare into something resembling a deadly mining operation. The concept sounds almost simple when you think about it. You dig underneath the enemy's wall, you prop everything up with wooden beams, then you light those beams on fire. When the wood burns away, the tunnel collapses, and suddenly, that imposing stone wall just crumbles like a house of cards. There was nothing glamorous about this method. No thundering catapults, no heroic charges, just men crawling through narrow tunnels, hauling out dirt one bucket at a time. Yet this quiet, invisible work could bring down fortifications that had stood for centuries. The ancient world knew this trick well. The Assyrians used early versions of tunneling, but it was the Greeks and Persians who really perfected the art. During one famous siege in ancient Greece, the Spartans decided to tunnel under the walls of Plataea. Sounds like a solid plan, except the defenders had the same idea. They dug their own tunnels, trying to intercept the Spartan miners underground. Imagine that scene for a moment. Soldiers crawling through pitch-black tunnels, hundreds of feet beneath the surface, listening for the sound of enemy picks striking stone. The moment they heard that telltale tapping, they knew the enemy was close. What followed were some of the most terrifying fights in military history. Brutal hand-to-hand combat, fought in spaces so narrow you could barely swing a sword. These underground battles happened by torchlight, men fighting with knives and shovels in tunnels that could collapse at any moment. There was no room for formation fighting, no space for tactics, just pure, claustrophobic violence in the dark. Some soldiers probably never saw daylight again, buried alive when tunnels caved in during these subterranean skirmishes. But when tunneling actually worked, the results were absolutely devastating. Take Rochester Castle in England, back in 1212. King John's engineers spent weeks digging beneath the southern wall. When they were ready, they packed the tunnel with pig fat, the medieval equivalent of explosives, and set it ablaze. The entire tower above came crashing down in what must have been one of the most shocking moments those defenders ever witnessed. By the 1200s, some engineers had turned this into a precise science. They could read soil like a book, predicting exactly how a wall would fall. These men were part geologist, part demolition expert, calculating the perfect spot to place their fires. They'd proved something that would echo through military history. If you can't go over a wall and you can't smash through it, you can always bring it down from below. Of course, the people inside these fortresses weren't just sitting there waiting to be undermined. Defenders had their own bag of tricks, and some of those tricks were absolutely terrifying. At the top of that list was something called Greek fire, a mysterious weapon that the Byzantines developed around the 7th century. Greek fire was like ancient napalm, a sticky burning substance that could be sprayed from tubes or thrown in clay pots. The truly horrifying thing about it was that water couldn't put it out. Ships would be reduced to floating infernos in minutes, sailors jumping overboard, only to find the flames following them into the sea. To this day, nobody knows exactly how it was made. The formula was kept so secret that it died with the Byzantine Empire. For more everyday terror, defenders relied on simpler but equally effective methods. Boiling liquids became the weapon of choice. Water, oil, or sand would be heated to scalding temperatures, then poured through murder holes, those cheerfully named openings in castle ceilings, directly onto attackers below. Oil was particularly feared because, unlike water, it stuck to everything. It would soak into clothing and seep into the joints of armor before being set on fire. Imagine climbing a siege ladder, almost reaching the top of the wall, only to be drenched in burning oil that you simply cannot remove. Hot sand was perhaps even worse in some ways. It would slip into every gap in a soldier's armor, around the neck, under the arms, cooking the flesh beneath while being impossible to brush away. Defenders also had gravity on their side, and they used it creatively. Massive stones would be dropped from the walls, not just to kill individual soldiers but to smash the siege engines below. Sometimes they dropped logs, barrels, or even dead animals, anything heavy enough to break both machines and morale. The psychological effect was just as important as the physical damage. Then, there were the traps. Hidden pits filled with spikes, bridges designed to collapse under weight, barricades that looked solid but would give way at the worst possible moment. Medieval castles became elaborate death puzzles, designed to confuse, delay, and punish anyone trying to get inside. All of these defenses served one crucial purpose: buying time. Every minute that a wall held was a minute closer to the attacking army, running out of supplies. Camps were breeding grounds for disease, and soldiers far from home grew restless as weeks turned to months. Meanwhile, relief armies might be marching to break the siege. This reveals something profound about medieval warfare. It wasn't really about the biggest catapult or the strongest wall. It was about patience, endurance, and the willingness to outlast your enemy. Siege warfare was ultimately a test of who could hold on longer, who could endure more suffering, while maintaining the will to fight. The attackers had physics and engineering on their side, massive machines that could hurl stones or tunnel beneath foundations. But the defenders had creativity born of desperation, and the fundamental advantage of fighting from behind walls they knew better than anyone. They had boiling oil and Greek fire, hidden passages, and secret stores of food. In this deadly game of patience, victory often came, not from a single brilliant stroke, but from the slow accumulation of small advantages. A successful tunnel here, a broken siege engine there, supplies running low, winter approaching. These were the real weapons of siege warfare, as important as any catapult or battering ram. War has always been about more than just breaking things. The real battle, it turns out, happens inside people's minds, long before the first stone crumbles. When ancient armies rolled their massive wooden towers across dusty plains, they weren't just bringing tools, they were bringing nightmares on wheels. Imagine standing on fortress walls, watching the horizon. First you'd hear them, these colossal machines, groaning and creaking like wounded giants. The sound would carry for miles, a slow rhythm of doom approaching your doorstep. Every squeak of those enormous wheels was designed to plant one terrible thought: you are not safe here anymore. The Assyrians understood this theater perfectly. They'd parade their siege engines openly, almost like a twisted carnival procession. Picture these massive contraptions being dragged across endless deserts, banners flying, soldiers marching in formation. It was all show, all designed to make defenders feel small and helpless before the real fighting even began. Romans took a different approach, but equally clever. They'd set up their siege camps right where everyone could see them. Defenders would stand on their walls, watching their enemies assemble battering rams and test catapults like workers setting up for a county fair. Except this fair was coming for their lives. The weapons themselves became characters in this deadly drama. When a trebuchet rolled into position, everyone inside the fortress would know it long before seeing it. That distinctive creaking of winches, the grinding of thick ropes under tension, the heavy thunk of counterweight dropping like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. But here's where siege warfare got truly psychological. Sometimes the ammunition carried messages more terrifying than the damage it caused. Severed heads of messengers would come flying over walls, still wearing their ceremonial armor. At Constantinople, defenders found themselves dodging not just rocks, but actual human bodies launched from enemy catapults. The most chilling example happened during the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346. Mongol forces began hurling plague-infected corpses over the city walls. This wasn't just warfare, it was biological terrorism centuries before anyone had names for such things. Those diseased bodies may have helped trigger outbreaks of the Black Death that eventually swept across Europe, killing millions. The unknown became the most powerful weapon of all. Defenders never knew what was coming next. Would the next projectile be a massive boulder, a barrel of burning oil, a shower of arrows, or just silence? That ominous, heavy silence, while engineers adjusted their aim, could drive people mad with anticipation. Even the rhythm of siege warfare became a psychological tool. The steady thump, thump, thump of battering rams against gates. The sudden quiet before a catapult released its load. These sounds would echo through fortress corridors, wearing down nerves just as surely as the machines wore down stone walls. Ancient commanders knew exactly what they were doing. Their goal wasn't just breaking walls, it was breaking spirits. They wanted defenders to believe their gods had abandoned them, that their mighty fortifications were nothing but temporary obstacles in the path of fate. When that mental dam finally cracked, gates often opened without any fight at all. This is the strange truth about siege warfare. Sometimes mines collapsed before masonry ever did. Then gunpowder arrived, thundering onto medieval battlefields like a violent revolution. The age of traditional siege engines came to a slow, splintering end. Cannons changed everything overnight. A single well-placed shot could accomplish in seconds what trebuchets needed hours to achieve. Those massive stone walls that had protected cities for centuries suddenly became liabilities. By the 15th century, Europe's great castles were crumbling, not from undermining or fire, but from iron cannonballs crashing through their ancient stones. Siege warfare had entered a new phase, explosive, brutal, and deafeningly loud. Yet the principles discovered by ancient siege engineers never really disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to catapults and trebuchets. Every ballistic missile, every long-range howitzer, is just a high-tech descendant asking the same fundamental question. How do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a safe distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all these concepts were discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before anyone ever heard of gunpowder. Ancient engineers working with wood, rope, and stone laid the groundwork for technologies we use today. Even modern military psychology borrows from ancient siege tactics. Shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, visible dominance, all have roots stretching back thousands of years. Those towering siege engines rolling forward with colorful banners snapping in the wind were the original shock and awe campaigns. They weren't just about breaching walls, they were about breaking the spirit of entire cities. You can still see their legacy carved into ruins of ancient places. At Masada, Roman siege ramps still scar the desert landscape like old wounds that refuse to heal. At Constantinople, layers upon layers of defensive walls tell stories of a city that stood against every imaginable machine for 1,000 years, until cannon fire finally brought them down. Medieval castles across Europe show this evolution too. Their round towers and angled bastions tell the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to survive the next siege, the next innovation in the art of breaking things. Today, even in our world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare hasn't vanished. It's simply gone digital. Cities are still surrounded, defenders still isolated, walls still built and broken. Modern walls might be firewalls, economic blockades, or media blackouts, but the soul of siege warfare remains unchanged. Someone wants to keep them out. Both sides are willing to wait, to build, to break whatever needs breaking to win. The battering rams are gone now. Trebuchets sit quietly in museums, but the spirit of siege warfare lives on, as persistent and destructive as ever.